Law class, Yvonne McDowell, who, if you can imagine what she's been doing, you've probably been in the situation, racing back to campus to try to get to your class. She just stepped off the plane. She's been avoiding that East Coast storm up from Georgia State. And she skillfully went through an extra layover at Dulles, just arrived, but Professor Yvonne McDowell to talk about the topic of the day in law.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to apologize. I might step over Professor Long's step, which you learned earlier today. But we're going to talk a little bit about violence in media. And I want to start by telling you a little bit of a story. This Sunday, I am from Atlanta. I watched my poor Falcons get demolished in the Super Bowl. And I watched this with my 4-year-old nephew. If you've ever watched football, it's an activity where two people are constantly banging into each other in such a violent manner, right? But it's fine. Kids can watch it. And so one of the things I'm going to talk about today is why violence, on its very nature, doesn't have sort of the same issues that, say, in obscenity would have, or something that may be deemed indecent. I heard that you talked about FCC v. Pacifica earlier this week, right? Okay, well, in that case, as you know, George Carlin, 7 words you can't say on television, and he said them and it was on the radio at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And so the Supreme Court ultimately decided that we can regulate what children hear at any particular time of day, right? During these particular times. If a child may be awake to hear it, then we can regulate it, because we have what's known as the government has an interest in protecting children. And we protect children against things that may be deemed indecent. But violence is not something that the government regulates quite so much. You might have an idea why that may not be. Give me anything. Go ahead.
Because you have the possibility to be drafted to the military and could do violence for the government, so it might be a responsibility if there was someday. That's
one way. Give me something else in media why the government may not regulate violence the same way.
If you regulate violence, then people might be concerned about airing news reports that have violence in them.
Exactly. We need the news, right? I don't need to curse in news reports. Like, I don't need to say the 7 words you can't say on television in a news report. But I may need to show violence in order for sort of the news to be seen, right? And so violence is sort of subjective. Who determines what is violent? As a kid, I watched Tom and Jerry. It is, at its core, about just as violent as 24. So if you think about it, the violence in the two situations is the same, but they're sort of thought of differently. And so because violence is subjective, because we look at it in different ways, we don't regulate in the same way as, say, George Carlin's 7 words, because the F word is the F word, no matter how you look at it. But violence, people view it in different types of ways. And so the government does have an interest in the protection of children, right? And so you'll often see when you study strict scrutiny, I don't know if you went over it yet, but if you look at strict scrutiny, the government always needs a compelling interest. Oh my God, what about the children? It's always a fairly compelling interest, making sure that they are protected in some kind of way. And so when you look at cases dealing with violence in certain type of media, that's going to be one of the arguments that's made. What about the children? And one question is, do children exposed to violence inherently become more violent? Would looking at this make me more violent? Right after the Columbine massacre, people sort of said they became violent because of violent video games. What do you think the government said in response to that particular argument? Do any of you play Grand Theft Auto? Did you play GTA when you were a teenager?
Yeah.
Yes. Because we do not regulate video games in the same type of way, right? You can put a label on it and say this is for mature audiences, but as far as stopping the release of that video game, the government doesn't do it in the same way that we regulate speech that may be deemed indecent. And a few years ago, the court looked at something very similar to what's known as Brown Entertainment, Brown v. Entertainment Merchants, right? There were a bunch of people, particularly in the state of California, and they wanted to regulate video games. And the video game companies were like, no, we need our money. We're not going to let you do that. And so they sued. And they went to court, and the first thing the plaintiff said, the first court found in favor of the plaintiff. They were like, this is an infringement upon free speech. because we don't look at violence in the same way as we look at indecency. And so they appealed, obviously. And the Ninth Circuit said what ultimately the Supreme Court is going to say. Violent video games do not constitute obscenity. Obscenity, as you may have learned, has no protection under the First Amendment. We can regulate it as we choose. But violence, that is speech. We don't regulate that in the same type of way. And so the state does not have a compelling interest, because remember, we're talking about strict scrutiny here, in protecting children from violent video games. Because they can't prove that violence is going to automatically make a child more violent. When you played GTA as a kid, did you want to go out and shoot somebody and rob a car? No. Most people don't. Right? And so the government can't prove that because you watch a violent video game, you're automatically going to want to go out and enact violence. And so the state of California didn't prove their case in that way. And even if the state has a compelling interest, the law is not narrowly tailored. You can't make a law to stop everybody from saying everything, to completely stop video games, right? And so just like even in George Carlin, they can only limit the time when children are listening to the radio or listening to broadcasting. You can't stop it completely. And so in this particular case, it's a video game, you can't stop it. It's too wide. We don't want to limit speech that much. So that was what the court looks at when they look at this idea of violence and regulating violence. Are we going to stop the speech? And so Justice Scalia, who decided this for the Supreme Court, said, yeah, states can block obscenity, but violence is not obscene. Because violence may be necessary in society. Like you said, it may be necessary for the news. It may be necessary in other areas. And so who are we to tell someone that you can't watch this because this is the type of violence we don't want you watching, but it's fine when Tom slices Jerry's head off or whatever, right? Because it's subjective. And because of that, regulating it becomes very difficult. Right? The regulation of violence is difficult because it is subjective. And that is what the court found, particularly with video games. And there's an argument to be made. I don't want my 4-year-old watching video games. Well, the government will say, great, that's what you do as a parent. That's not our job to do. And so there comes the regulation. The government is saying, we're going to allow adults and parents to make this decision, and we're not going to make them for them. We'll make it for you in saying that radio stations can't air curse words at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but we're not going to make it for you in this case. Any questions? And I apologize if I talk fast. I had a court reporter stand up in the middle of court and tell me to slow down. So that happens. So thank you guys for indulging me. If you have any questions, please ask.
Sure.
There's one.
Maybe we can do, yeah, good. The question, yay.
So where does the argument arise around video games where there's a difference between watching something and then actually carrying out the actions? Obviously through a simulated thing, but you're still making the character commit violence. Like
virtual reality?
Well, I mean just video games in general, I guess. Virtual reality would definitely be more immersive, but...
The argument, I think, would arise in the idea that you can sort of carry out this violence in this game without having to go and carry it out in the real world, right? And the argument was because if someone is sitting playing Halo, for instance, and that's all they do all day long, the state wanted to argue that person, particularly if they're a child, because they're susceptible to that, will be more likely to go out and shoot people. But that's not always the case, right? And that's rarely ever the case. I played Halo a lot in law school. It's what got me through. But that I didn't want to go out and shoot anybody. It was sort of like, you can't prove this nexus. And because you can't prove this nexus, limiting it totally is against the Constitution. Okay.
But wouldn't as a video game player, aren't you it's in first person, right? So you're the one committing the crime, but watching a broadcast of coverage is some war zone coverage, you're not committing the act, you're just observing it as a third party. Mm-hmm. So wouldn't that be grounds to say that can be screened, or that doesn't that separate the two?
That would be an argument the state would have made, and the court would still say the same, no. Because we can't, it's very difficult, If I say all first-person games are not allowed, right? That would sort of limit the speech of those content creators.
Okay.
And by limiting that speech, I'm infringing upon their First Amendment rights. Because that speech is just as valid as news speech. And so limiting one against the other, the court doesn't sort of want to play into that role. They don't want to get into that sort of nitty-gritty idea. Good question. Any other? Go ahead.
And violence is subjective, so for some people maybe like it's not as like intense to see something like some type of violence and it's not going to affect them in some way, but another person is going to go out and cause them to do that. Like at what point is it like the majority of people it's not going to affect? Like how many people does it have to affect and incite violence in for it to become a problem?
If you go down that road, you're starting to limit content for people who don't have that issue. What you may want to do is make sure people who do have those issues are sort of regulated in a different type of way. Look at their own mental health issue, because you can't stop speech to people who don't have those problems because these few people do.
And how do you like regulate those people with mental health issues?
That is left up to either you regulate when they go to see someone with mental health, but you can't. Stopping the speech is not something we can do, but we can talk. Parents can regulate it, right? This particular was about the children getting access to it. So you're a parent, make sure your children doesn't watch this. We have ways to sort of, if you want to stop your children from watching things on Netflix, for instance, put in a code to make sure your child doesn't watch this. The parent or the guardian is the one that's best able to determine whether or not that child is able to deal with the situation. And so we let them parent, and the government doesn't take that role.
Has there ever been any discussion on whether or not the parents are the best judges of giving their kids access, like access to them?
There is discussion, but ultimately, and this is more of a state court issue, they've always determined that parents are the guardians. They're the ones who make that choice. And so if the government steps in, they feel that they're taking away the ability of the parent to parent. And plus, you're stopping everybody who wants to play Halo from being able to play Halo. I didn't shoot anyone when I was in high school. Why are you taking away my ability to use that? Right? And so that is the argument of the government. We're not going to stop your speech from people who should be able to have access to it because you don't know the role your child should be able to play in that situation. Any other questions? You guys are good.
Oh, yeah. Totally. We had a couple of handouts that maybe you would like to help us with. We were talking about virtual reality and why virtual reality may actually be a different story than this, because in virtual reality it's even more dangerous, perhaps. You're getting more of a message from the director, and because it has an effect on your brain and maybe the development of your eyes if you're a child.
Yeah.
So do you think there's likely to be a court differentiation between these sort of hyper-realistic virtual reality things?
I think with virtual reality it's a little bit different because there is an actual physical issue at play in there, right? Like if you've ever worn a VR headset, it says don't allow children 12 or younger to use them, because it may actually affect their sort of brain stimulation and their eyesight. And so for that, they may step in and regulate it because they can see an actual physical harm. Courts have always been more likely to regulate when they can see an actual physical harm, as opposed to sort of this possible mental harm. And so I think regulation in that area may be because of the actual physical harm they can test and see in children overall. And so I think that's more likely to be regulated than regulate video games where, sure, mom says back away from the television, but that's not really that issue. That issue with video games is making sure that this child is sort of not influenced negatively by it. And so I think the VR regulation is possibly more likely. After I read that article. Go ahead.
Do you think that even arguing for physical harm, though, might have encounter some roadblocks, like what you just said with TV, where your mom could just say back away from it, or like when you're using a laptop, that's also proven to destroy your eyesight, especially if you're using it in the dark for long periods of time, if they don't have to issue warnings against that kind of stuff, and they don't experience regulation for that. So would you say that seems unfair, especially if you could just lower the brightness on your phone or something like that?
Good question. I'm not a doctor. But I would say that in that situation, VR, because it's so submersive, If you've ever worn a VR headset, it's not like being in front of a television. It sort of becomes part of you, and there have been studies that have shown that children particularly, which is why they should not have on a VR headset, sort of become immersed in it and can't separate it from reality. And in addition to the eyesight issue, there is this separation, and it's much more popular than, say, with a video game, with a first-person shooter, right? They sort of become, they can't separate the reality from the VR, and so that's why I think VR may be regulated differently. VR is regulated differently when dealing with obscenity as well, but I won't get into that this yet. Okay.
In comparing VR to like controller type, like I know you're kind of making an argument that like the encapsulation of your eyesight and your ears is an overwhelming sense of like distortion of what could be real or what's not real. But couldn't the same argument be made for the kinds of games that the controller actually looks and functions as if you're firing a gun or swinging a sword? Whereas with a VR thing, that could be the case, but it's also the case that you're just still kind of using a small handheld controller. But couldn't those same kind of action leading to, like it feels like that act much more so with that controller shaped like a gun? Couldn't that, because those kinds of controllers don't exist, couldn't that same argument be applied as a reason for it to not incite violence in the same way that VR could or couldn't?
That is an argument to be made, but I still don't think that is as submersive as VR, right? Playing Duck Hunt, going back many years to when I was a child, it feels like a toy. Like even those sort of guns still sort of feel like a toy, and I'm not in that world. It's still sort of outside of me. With VR, I am in that situation. And I think that because it is submersive in a way that video games are not, I think it could be regulated more heavily. And, you know, I'm not on the Supreme Court. They won't let me. But if I were, that's sort of the argument I look at.
We had a long discussion a little while ago about, we looked at a bunch of cases that kind of came close to incitement. And the question over here was, well, is there anything that's incitement? Can we hypothesize something that a film could do, or a game could do, or music could do, that actually incites somebody to do something icky?
A few years ago, and I'm really bad with details, the girl, and it was more of like a social media thing, the Thin Man.
Oh yeah,
Slender Man.
Slender Man.
That may be something that could have done inciting. Sort of like, because they became so submersed in this idea. That may be an inciting thing. I tend to lean, just because of what, I tend to lean more towards deregulation, particularly in terms of video games and film, because I'm a filmmaker and I make violent movies. So I tend to lean more towards like the idea of deregulation and letting parents do that. But in that case, I think that could be, and somewhere along those lines, where it might have been an inciting incident.
I don't remember, did Slender Man tell them to kill her?
No, they said they killed her because of Slender Man. He didn't actually say kill her or go do this. Wasn't that right? It's a few years ago. My mind is.
Yeah, they just kind of let their imaginations go crazy.
Yeah.
They were like, we're going to offer her to Slender Man.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Slender Man was just like a drawing, and people just crazy with it.
Yeah. Any other questions?
What do you think about all the violence and incitement on Twitter?
I think Twitter, being a private entity, should regulate their company better because they are a private entity. And so when you see sort of these people that are sort of harassing people and saying, I'm going to do things to you, because Twitter's a private company, they don't have to deal with the First Amendment issue. We're going to regulate our company like we want to regulate it. I think they need to deal more with that and get better on regulating sort of the bullying that's happening on the network.
What's the difference between incitement and bullying?
Incitement is encouraging someone to incitement is where someone is encouraged to enact violence because of what's happening. Bullying is when someone is bullying someone as a result of sort of Twitter or sort of trolls jumping all over you.
So if I over Twitter tweeted at you and I said kill yourself and you killed yourself, would that be incitement?
depends on who you're saying it to. I always think about audience.
If I said it to you, and then
If you said it to me
then
and I'm the type of person who's already likely to kill myself.
What if you're not likely to kill? Like, what if you have any type of mental state, but you then killed yourself after I told you to kill yourself? Like, how is that not incitement?
It doesn't, I don't think it rises to the level of incitement. Because you're telling me to kill myself. And I'm looking at this from the perspective of do you have some power over me? Going back to Brandenburg. Do you have some power over me? Am I likely to listen to you? What you're saying is going to make me kill myself? I don't think it would.
Well, we just looked at the Nazi Osborne case where a mentally unwell, like 19-year-old or something, was listening to his music and very shortly after killed himself. And it was almost, he didn't end up getting, the plaintiff didn't end up winning, but they almost said it was incitement because his lyrics, like, a lot of times will say stuff about committing suicide, etc. And if you can say, if like music lyrics are almost incitement, how would we directly telling you to kill yourself not be incitement?
I don't think it's incitement.
Okay.
But the music and I actually, I've looked at that case. I can see where the music lyrics are incitement if Ozzy I think it depends on one, the audience, and two, the person saying it. And as in all things in media. So if this particular audience member is more likely to listen to this particular author or content creator, then maybe. But you telling me to kill myself, I have no reason to listen to you. Right? And so I don't view that as incitement because you don't carry the power over me that will make me likely to listen to what you have to say. Yeah.
Do you think it takes away, still on that example, that it was like a person-to-person message versus like we talking about music, it's like a very broad audience. Film, it doesn't have that immediate automatic, let's say, big audience where incitement might be a potential threat. So I don't know, I'm just wondering if that single, just because I said it, if it doesn't matter versus having it be a large audience be exposed to something like a direct demand, let's say.
Yes, one thing to look at when you look at Brandenburg is the power of the person speaking the word and the likelihood of the audience to listen to what they're saying. Right? Going back to, and so I think that one reason for something to be incited, the person saying it needs to have some power or control over the audience member. And if that person carries that weight, then you're more likely to lead to incite, something that's being incited. Any other questions? You guys keep me on my toes. Haven't felt like this since I was in Port Fields.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.